What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Rewired Soul podcast. And before I introduce this amazing author, I have some exciting news for you. Today, well, first, the not so exciting news. I turned 36 years old. I don't like getting older. But anyways, the exciting news is today I am also 9 years clean and sober. And I know, wherever you're listening to this at, you're probably clapping and applauding. Thank you. But yeah, 9 years ago, I was dying from my drug and alcohol addiction. And, I was an alcoholic for a long time. But once I found prescription opioids, it really took me down quick, and it was an addiction that I couldn't kick, and I struggled with multiple relapses. Many of you who have been following my YouTube channel for years, you've heard me share my story and stuff like that. But anyways, since getting sober, one of the things I try to do is not only help people who are struggling with addiction, but also loved ones. And one of my top priorities is decreasing the stigma and spreading awareness. So it's crazy. It's serendipitous that today's guest is author and former prosecutor, Charlotte Bismuth. And she wrote a book called Bad Medicine. And it's the story about how she took down this pill-pushing doctor named Dr. Lee in New York who was prescribing opioids and benzodiazepines and stimulants, and people were dying and parents were losing their children. And Charlotte wrote this book, and it's the story of the trial and how she learned about this and everything. So I always have such respect for people who aren't, either an addict themselves in recovery or, has a loved one, and they find out about this issue and they join the fight along with us. So I really respect the hell out of Charlotte because she's dedicated a lot of, her work and her life to spreading awareness and trying to make change happen. And her book is absolutely phenomenal. As someone who's like, who tries to write, as well, like, I'm blown away by people like Charlotte. I'm like, oh, cool, you're a lawyer? And then I see how she writes and how amazing her writing style is and how she was able to suck me into her book, even though I typically don't read books like this. I'm just like, oh, great. She has a bajillion skills and she's awesome at so many things. But yeah, it's extremely well written, and I'm so glad that I was able to talk to her about her book. We cover a lot of important topics. So since it's my birthday, got a couple favors, all right? Do me a favor, make sure you share this episode. Share this episode, help spread some awareness about the opioid epidemic, what's going on, especially when it pertains to prescription opioids, because Charlotte and I talk about vetting doctors and trusting doctors and everything like that, because it's something that we have to do. So this is very important. Make sure that you share it. And the other favor, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoy it, rate it, review it. That helps the algorithm, and it helps spread the podcast out to brand new people and grow this beautiful little community that we got here. And yeah, a lot of you have reached out to me and stuff like that. And if you didn't know, down in the description below, aside from, Charlotte's social media and her book, you'll also find my social media and stuff like that. So follow me, shoot me a DM, tweet at me, message me on Instagram, whatever you want to do. All right. But anyways, I'm super excited about this episode. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Charlotte Bismuth. Hey, Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast to discuss your awesome book, Bad Medicine. And yeah, I want to get started. So as a recovering opioid addict myself, a prescription opioid addict, just celebrated 9 years, I think it's extremely important that we share these stories, and I really appreciate that you took the time to share the stories of these people we've lost to addiction or are currently struggling, as well as the family members. And even after this case, you still fight to help with this prescription opioid problem. So for you, what motivates you to keep fighting this fight?
I wanted to become a prosecutor to see life as it really was. I knew that there were people suffering, and I wanted to be on their side. As an appellate attorney for the DA's office, I defended convictions, and I handled a lot of cases that were very violent and upsetting. The case of Dr. Lee was violent too, but in a different way. It was emotionally violent. It was about betrayal. And that was especially shocking and unforgettable and unforgivable. What I saw also, though, was incredible courage. Courage despite a tremendous amount of stigma and despite a tremendous amount of suffering. So that's really why I'm still committed to the cause of the opioid epidemic, and especially to giving a voice to all those who have suffered. I believe that they've been wronged by people in positions of power whom they trusted, and they've been blamed for it. That makes me really angry. I want those who are truly responsible for the opioid epidemic to be held accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it always kind of blows my mind that, that more people aren't fully aware, but as you mentioned, there's a stigma, and, we don't talk about it enough. And that's why I appreciate people like you who are, dedicating so much of your work to helping to fight this fight and hold people in positions of power accountable and all of that. Like, even in my active addiction, I had a very limited view of the problem, right? It was me, it was, the people I used with and stuff like that. And then, when I started working in treatment, we were constantly full. We were constantly full. And yeah, sure, there were people who were coming in for addictions to alcohol and, methamphetamines and things like that. But the number one was prescription medications, obviously opioids, but also, Adderall and benzodiazepines and things like that. But when you look at it too, like you have these heroin addicts, like I was 2 steps away from being a heroin addict myself, just because buying prescription opioids were so dang expensive. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's interesting that that we're still having to show awareness, even though the epidemic has been going on for so long. So one of the things I really loved about the book is that this story is something that we don't really acknowledge or talk about that much. And your book, it really showcases how we sometimes blindly trust doctors and forget that they're human too. And humans can be driven by their own personal greed and other motives, which can result, like we saw in the story of, you prosecuting Dr. Lee, it can result in doctors overprescribing these medications. So in your opinion, and based on your experience, what are some things that just the average person can do, or even a loved one can do, to recognize whether or not a doctor is doing what's in their best interest?
So this is a really important question, and I actually think it applies more broadly than just when we're seeking care from a physician. I have learned from seeking help for my depression and anxiety, as well as I think in life generally from the hits that we all take, to trust people, first of all, who tell the truth, especially when it comes to admitting what they know and what they don't know. I trust people who do their homework and who invest time in research when they're presented with new information that might change or undermine one of their preconceptions. I trust people who are compassionate and who are not just able to perceive the suffering of others, but ask themselves, and of course there are boundaries here that are applicable, but who ask themselves how they can help. For my own doctors, I have trusted most, and I have been helped the most by the ones who take the time to talk, to get to know me, to ask good questions, not just about me, but my environment, my family, who respond to new information and who refer me to specialists when they don't know the answer to a question. I wish that we had a healthcare system that would allow us to trust that every doctor was able to take the time to do their work that way and to really put the best interest of the patient first.
Absolutely. And I could not agree more. So personally, as somebody who suffered from a prescription drug addiction, it was really difficult for me personally to start trusting doctors, right? Like I had so many medical issues. I was 27, had congestive heart failure, but I knew I had to trust doctors, but at the same time, I was like, well, these doctors will also give me just about anything I ask for. So it's been a long journey of, learning to trust doctors, mainly when it's, a doctor that I can't build a relationship with. But I tell my girlfriend this all the time. Like, I am so fortunate to have found my primary care doctor. I've had her for a few years now. And I've interacted with many doctors where I'm like, hey, by the way, first thing to let you know, I'm a recovering addict. I can't take anything that might become addictive, da 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 da. And they're like, yeah, whatever. Like after I got into my a car accident when I was about 2 years sober, I had this doctor at the emergency room trying to push opioids on me like 5 times. I'm like, where were you during my active addiction? So I really appreciate my new doctor, like you were saying, my primary care doctor. She takes the time to sit there and talk with me and ask me questions. And, like you mentioned too, like I struggle with my own mental health issues, and she prescribes my antidepressants. And she sits there and she talks to me about life and my mental health and everything like that, and kind of takes everything into consideration. And, I used to get so mad, when you go to the doctor and like, your appointment's at like 10 a.m. and then you're sitting there until like 10:45 or whatever. I used to get so mad, like, what are they doing? But with my primary care doctor, I don't even get upset because I know that she's sitting there and taking the time to talk with her other patients, and she does the same with me. And I'm sure she's late to other appointments because of me. And I love her so much, and I just hope that she is my primary care doctor forever. But yeah, I definitely agree that we have to, build that trust and know somebody who is updating their opinions on the new research and everything like that. But the last thing I'll say on that too is this is one of the reasons why I found it so important to educate myself about these medications, the addiction epidemic. And, even though I love and trust my doctor, I always try to get a second opinion too from other people in my life who are either in the medical profession or have experience taking the medication and stuff like that. So one of the most difficult parts about fighting this prescription opioid problem is that chronic pain is a legitimate issue. And as somebody who has made YouTube videos and I've done talks about, the prescription drug epidemic in the United States, like some of the most vocal people are people who do struggle with legitimate chronic pain, whether it's from an old injury or, getting older and all that natural stuff. But anyways, these people who struggle with chronic pain, they're having to deal with all of the regulation that's coming along because of the opioid epidemic, which can make it difficult for them to get medications. And, as somebody who's worked in treatment and met a lot of addicts, I know that it's difficult just personally to tell who's legitimately struggling with pain or who's just like, wants their fix, because I used to fake pain because I wanted more drugs. But anyways, doctors have to struggle with this too. So here's my question. In a perfect world, Charlotte, what would you do so people received pain medications when they need them while also recognizing that they could be extremely addictive?
This is such an important question. Big Pharma, while allegedly trying to protect chronic pain patients, has actually placed them between a rock and a hard place. I actually saw this in the prosecution of Dr. Lee, where the young man who initially called in the tip, who I named Eddie Valora in the book to protect his real identity, was suffering from an incredibly painful chronic pain condition, a degenerative neurological disease. And he had been unable to get treatment from physicians who didn't believe the amount of pain that he was reporting. And so he ended up going to see Dr. Lee, thinking that at least from Dr. Lee he would be able to get the medication he needed to survive the pain. The problem was that Dr. Lee cared so little and was so focused on the money that he actually caused this young man to suffer an overdose. He gave him not just painkillers like oxycodone and others, but he combined them with Xanax. And the young man almost died. And that's why he ended up coming forward, because even though he'd seen that he could finally get the medications that he needed, it was coming at such a high risk that not only was it not worth his life, but he was very worried that others would get hurt. In a perfect world, the medical profession would not be corrupted by money or by the influence of big pharmaceutical marketing, and our healthcare system would actually provide full, affordable coverage and even preventive care to minimize suffering. I'm particularly concerned to see on social media the way that chronic pain patients are pitted against those of us like me who have fought to hold corrupt doctors or corrupt pharmaceutical executives accountable. The only people that serves are those who are escaping accountability so far, who sparked the opioid epidemic. And I wish that there were a way to bridge this perceived gap, because we all share the hope that suffering will be reduced and that lives will be saved.
Yeah, and I think you bring up such a great point. And I think, not to get too far into the weeds on this issue, but I do think, this is an issue that we see in so many different aspects of, living in, this kind of culture where we make money the priority, under capitalism, right? Where the people who are making billions and billions, like you've been talking a lot recently on Twitter and everything about, like, Purdue Pharma and, their bankruptcy and the trials they've been going through and all that stuff. But, it's so rare that these people are held accountable because they're so good at pitting us against each other, right? So like you said, you're having people who struggle with chronic pain who are coming after you for wanting to save lives from, people like Dr. Lee who are pushing these medications. And, sometimes I don't want to make a blanket statement, but sometimes it seems like, we're going against each other instead of sitting there and saying, look, maybe if there was better regulation, maybe if there was better preventative care, maybe if, there were more affordable ways to get treatment and, we didn't have to go through this insane healthcare system, maybe both people, both the ones who struggle with addiction and both, the people struggling with chronic pain, we could figure something out, but instead, big pharma is able to make us attack each other, right? Instead of looking at what they're doing. And it's crazy because, I get it. I get that people struggle with chronic pain. Like I tore my knee in high school and I had to have surgery. And like I mentioned earlier, I got into a car accident. And thank God I didn't break any bones or anything like that. And I can look back at that pain, or even like when I did a cold turkey detox from opioids, like in that extreme pain. And I'm like, I don't even think it's a pain that's even comparable to some people who have, like a slipped disc in their back or, whatever. So I understand. And I think, personally, that we need a lot more funding and research for not only alternative treatment methods for pain, but also better ways to gauge and study pain, because right now, my main concern is that it's so subjective, pain, right? Like when I was just seeking pills, doctor comes in, hey, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Always an 8 or a 9. Always an 8 or a 9. Maybe a 7, but always 8 or 9, And, they don't have a way to really check and see if I'm drug seeking or if I'm actually experiencing that pain. So yeah, hopefully, with people who are doing the work like you are and raising awareness, we can hopefully bridge this gap and the two communities can kind of come together and we can find, some solutions. So in the case with Dr. Lee, he's selling these pills to people who end up dying. And in the book, you did a great job explaining the different types of charges that can be brought on someone and which types of punishments can be given for those charges. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about drug dealers. So in this case, you can argue that the doctor knew what he was doing and was in a sound state of mind. But something that I'm often curious about, especially because of my personal experience of dealing with drug dealers who are often using as well, like many of these drug dealers, they're addicts themselves, or they grew up in situations where they had to sell drugs to provide for their families. So in your opinion, do you think that street drug dealers should be held to the same standard as doctors who abuse their power to write prescriptions?
Absolutely not. Someone with education, opportunities, knowledge, and power should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I believe that substance use disorder is an illness, that it is not a crime. I also believe that there are a tremendous number of preconceptions and biases that are folded into the law enforcement notion that we only prosecute drug dealers who are selling, quote unquote, for profit. I think we really need to think about what that means and what it looks like. We're certainly in a society where there are communities where profit and status are built in, where they're sort of part of the woodwork, an expectation of the people who grow up there, and that therefore those people don't get stigmatized for seeking profit and may actually be harming others or exploiting the pain or substance use disorder of others, but not considered to be doing it for profit or in a criminal way, the way that some from more underprivileged backgrounds may do so. And I find that appalling. Again, I think that even in overdose death cases, it's really, really important to think critically about drug-induced homicide laws and how they're applied, to make sure that when prosecutors or in law enforcement go up the chain to the distributors, they are going past all of the people who suffer from the illness of substance use disorder, and making sure that they are going back up to the absolute root cause, to those who are truly aware, truly betraying a trust, and in control of their circumstances sufficiently that they can be held responsible.
Charlotte, you are absolutely amazing. And and I'm just so glad that there are people like you who are, in this fight, right? And it's so important because you bring up, the fact that it's such a nuanced kind of conversation, and how we need drug reform. And as we all know, the war on drugs has been this absolute failure. But yeah, I don't think, people fully understand. And it's not just the criminal justice system, but it's just people in general, because of the stigma of addiction. And when we look at, addicts or even dealers, like I had a lot of dealers, like I didn't have like those dealers like that you see on TV who are dealing, drugs like meth or heroin or whatever. You meet them in some shady street corner or what. Like my dealers were all like older ladies, right? They were just like older women. And most of them were, older women who became addicted to the same medications that I did because they were prescribed them by a physician and stuff like that. And then when they started needing more, they started selling their pills so they can buy more, right? So some of these dealers are selling just so they can feed their own addiction, right? And that's what we have to take into consideration. But like you mentioned too, I believe one of the biggest steps is that we start to see addiction as an illness. As soon as we start getting in the conversation as, addiction is a choice, that's when we can start saying, okay, well, if addiction's a choice and it's not an illness, people have full control over their actions and everything like that. Despite the fact that there's so much scientific evidence about the changes in the brain that happen and why this is an illness and not just something where someone wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to destroy my life, sell drugs, or I'm going to take drugs and, do all this other stuff. We really need to see it for what it is and then kind of look at it, these criminal cases on a case-by-case basis, who is this? Because there definitely are people who are like a Dr. Lee, but, the street level Dr. Lee, and they are purely doing this for profit. There are people who just have complete bad intentions with all this. And so we got to kind of look at it case by case, and, maybe, the defense has to be able to prove that this person also struggles with an addiction. You know what I mean? But yeah, anyways, I have one last question for you. And it's about big pharma and politics and all that. So some people know this, some people don't. I wish more people knew about this. But big pharma plays a huge role in our politics. And many of these pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money lobbying politicians. When running for office, many of these politicians say that they want to fight the drug epidemic, but they often blame the addict, which is exactly what Purdue Pharma's strategy was. So in your opinion, what could our politicians do to really help end the prescription drug epidemic that's been getting worse and worse over, the last 10 plus years?
There's so much to be done. I think one of the first steps is consciousness raising. And I think we saw some of that last year during the congressional hearing where, on a bipartisan basis, members of both parties expressed a tremendous amount of anger, disgust, and disappointment at the Sackler members of the Sackler family who were testifying before them about their role in sparking the opioid epidemic. But there's so much more to be done. And on a practical level, I think there are three things that would be a priority to save lives. The first is to make buprenorphine treatment available to all, including prison inmates, immediately. There are people who are suffering upon incarceration from withdrawal, which, I can't even imagine the level of suffering that must be involved in that when you're in a prison setting. We only have 5% of doctors who are allowed to prescribe buprenorphine. That's obviously way too small compared to the population of people who suffers from substance use disorder and who could be getting immediate relief. Two, I think implementing harm reduction practices ranging from widespread use of Narcan or naloxone, needle exchanges, and even to considering safe consumption sites. I know it's maybe strange to hear a former prosecutor saying that, but I have met too many people who have told me that their child died alone because they felt that they had to hide. And if it were my child, all I would ask for is that they be near someone who could help them if they needed the help, and just be given the chance to live long enough to seek treatment. Three, I'm really offended by the reports that we've seen lately about the money trail from big pharma to medical oversight boards and medical associations and nonprofit groups. I think there's this corruption of the medical network that makes it very, very hard to trust, as we discussed earlier, that doctors are really acting in the best interests of patients and that they're working with the best and most objective information. So if there's any way to stop that, to stop pharmaceutical advertising, to stop advertising even directly to physicians, to find a way to make the education of physicians in the emergence of new medications free from the influence of big pharma, I think that would go a very, very long way. And of course, none of these are simple. None of these are easy or short-term solutions. And some of them are really not popular. I mean, I think harm reduction, raises a lot of questions and a lot of hesitations in people. But I just believe that we have to ask ourselves at some point, what is our goal? What is more valuable? Is it preserving the status quo and keeping things familiar in a way that we can recognize and that we're used to? Or is it saving lives? And I, as a mom, as a community member, I want to put lives first.
I love it. I absolutely love it. That's such a great way to to end this conversation. And there's so much that you just talked about that I didn't even know about, right? Like, 5% of doctors who are allowed to prescribe Suboxone and help people, that's madness. But yeah, and this is why I love talking to people like you and spreading this awareness, because people might not know what's going on the local level. But anyways, thank you so much, Charlotte, for coming on the podcast to discuss your book and this really, really important conversation. And yeah, for everybody out there listening, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, but do me a favor, do yourself a favor. Okay. It's my birthday today, so I'm gonna ask you for a couple favors. All right. Like I mentioned earlier, do me a favor, share this episode. Share this episode on social media. Help spread some awareness about the opioid epidemic, what's going on, some things that we don't talk enough about, involving doctors and things like that, as well as the criminal justice system. But also make sure you check the description and follow Charlotte. Follow Charlotte. After getting her book, I found her on Twitter. That's how we connected, and she's constantly sharing news and updates about the addiction epidemic and everything like that. So make sure you follow her and pick up a copy of Bad Medicine. Like, let me tell you, I typically don't read books like this that are just like kind of a story or a narrative. And it's crazy. It's crazy that she's such a great writer, But anyways, check out the description, follow Charlotte, grab a copy of the book. And yeah, if you enjoy the podcast, if you're new, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. If you're over on Apple, leave a review, rate it. And yeah, we're a newer podcast, so it helps spread the word. The algorithm's like, oh, people enjoy this, and it gets the word out there. So subscribe, rate it, review it, share it, all that stuff really, really helps. And if you want to support the podcast in any other way, check down in the description below. If you're someone like me who struggles with mental health issues, I have written some mental health books. They're at the rewiredsoul.com, which is linked down below. And there's also an affiliate link for BetterHelp online therapy. As I mentioned in this episode, I have struggled with mental health issues for most of my life, and therapy is very important to me. And I personally used BetterHelp online therapy. It's super convenient. So if you want to check it out, they're affordable. It's all online and it's awesome. So check out the description down below. But anyways, thank you again so much to Charlotte for coming onto the podcast. And yeah, it's still June, so I will have another episode for all of you this coming Friday. And next week, I'm doing something really, really cool. So anyways, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you next time.